Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Lewis, and I'm here with my guest, Dave Anderson. Would you like to introduce yourself and your career?
Yeah, I'm David Anderson, and I started in computers back in 1977. And I just recently retired 2 or 3 years ago, and different aspects of the industry as it grew through the 70s, 80s, and to what we have now.
All right.
So
Thank you. So, David, first off, thank you for coming.
certainly, yeah,
Appreciate it.
happy to do this. Yeah.
So, starting off, getting into the field of computers. I mean, that's a very broad term. Computers.
hmm
So, um, that's kind of good because it also allows. I'm guessing it allows for many people to be able to come into this field. Would you say that?
I
Or
would. And, I probably should qualify that when I got into computers, there weren't computers.
Mm,
So there was no such thing as IT and 30 years into my career was .com. So the computers that I started with were more rudimentary. Now, to be honest with you, IBM had a computer the size of this room in the late 70s. But to just give you kind of a perspective, when I went to college in 1977, a month after I started classes, Tandy Radio Shack released their first home personal computer.
mm,
And it was a thing because you couldn't just go buy a computer in 1977. You
right.
know, industry had it, airlines had it. Obviously, engineering jobs, manufacturing things utilize computers of sort. But as far as anything like we know today, personal computers did not exist in 1977. You know,
Wow.
so the fun thing I always think about my career was I got to see it grow from nothing. And it turns out, I mean, here we are using a computer. I have a computer on my wrist. I mean, computers are everywhere, right?
Yes.
How would we live without IT in this day and age? So it's a very exciting field, very dynamic. Yeah. Um, but I have to give credit where credit is due. Where I was born on a 300-acre corn farm, I am the oldest. And so the understanding was I would come back and be a farmer,
Okay.
take on the family business, if you will, because my great grandfather homesteaded. My grandfather was born and lived there. My dad was born and lived there, and I was born there.
Mhm.
And so in 1977, my dad, when he said, "What are you going to do for college?" I said, "I'd really like to get into computers." I said, "Because I think they will be everywhere." And he looked at me in 1976, 77, and he said, "There'll be a computer in every tractor." And this is a man who went into the Navy in the 40s after high school to learn electronics because he knew there would be electronics in things, even in the 40s,
Hmm.
you know. And so, unfortunately, I guess I went to computer school and never went back to the farm. you in all fairness, I have a younger sister who manages the farm and took over the family legacy of doing that. But that's why I went to computer school.
Okay.
Is my father's urging.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, okay. So now, for individuals looking to get into it, what do you think are some of the kind of like bedrock things that they need to have before they pivot into this? I mean, granted, nowadays that's really easy because most
Yeah.
everybody's familiar with iPhones, laptops,
Sure.
Android
Yeah.
phones, Microsoft, any sort of PC,
hmm
laptop.
I think probably the easiest way to answer your question is to kind of peel back the onion and say, okay, we use computers for everything. But if your career is going to be IT, it's more than likely going to be some service oriented,
Mhm.
right? Specifically, what I ended up doing as my career after about 5 years of working local IT jobs was I ended up working with the airlines. And so everything that they need to know about you being an airline when you fly is on a computer.
Right.
And then when you get to where you're going, you rent the car or you stay at the hotel or you go to the concert or you do and all those things. So all that service oriented information. But it's all the same thing we learned in kindergarten. Who, what, when, where, why, you know?
Right.
And so instead of them selling tickets for an airplane and writing it on a sticky note, if you will, and saying nobody can sit in 1C tomorrow, LA to, it's on a computer somewhere. But I think the biggest thing back to your question is you have to have an understanding of, am I going to sit in a dark corner somewhere and build computers, maintain computers, engineer computers, or am I going to use them in my job as a service organization, right?
Right.
Because the guys working at McDonald's are using a computer to order your breakfast, let alone everybody that's billing for the power company, the water company, so everything is kind of the sky's the limit, I guess, would be the thought, And part of me, not to be a smart aleck, but are there any jobs now that a person would go into that you don't have to have some level of IT?
Few and far between.
Yeah, healthcare. I mean, right? And again, I'm kind of thinking more service oriented, right?
Right.
But even my best friend who retired the same time I did, he had to learn computers to manage power grid for Georgia Power. So I think, like you said, it's kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, you want to learn computers, even if it is just your PC or your laptop or your iPhone.
Right. So did you have a specialty in computers, or was there?
Well, I did. And so, again, I got to go back to the 70s. My intent was to go learn how to program computers. COBOL, BASIC, Fortran, some of these languages that nobody uses in this day and age. And kind of at the 11th hour, which really bothered my mother, I was all set to go to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and learn programming. And I had an opportunity to go to school and learn how a computer works, not just how to program the computer.
Right.
So I started at the component level. And no surprise, I ended up learning how to program them, because to use them from that, you had to learn to program them. But it wasn't the end user interface when I first went to college, So I think getting involved in that and having that career trajectory, and when I first got out of school, those jobs were hard to find. They were few and far between. So I was in this true service organization. I carried a little tool bag, an attaché tool bag, and went around to attorneys' offices and publishers and everything and worked on their computers that printed manuals, printed legal documents, printed, that kind of thing. And some of that was very mechanical, and some of it was truly computer-based, And then I was very lucky to get a job in the food service industry, where instead of calling into the distributors, the restaurants around Kansas City, where I was living at the time, were able to get on a very basic keyboard monitor setup and say, I want 100 pounds of tomatoes, 200 pounds of hamburger, or whatever the staples were, versus getting on the phone or making an order in person, And so all appropriately, it was named Food Service Network, But what was fun about that job was we took a dumb terminal, if you will, and we programmed the EEPROM, so we didn't have to transmit across the phone line the screens and the menus and everything. We just had to transmit the trigger that said, display this. And then they could tab through the fields and say, I want 100 pounds of tomatoes or 100 pounds of onions or whatever, So it was very interesting to do that at a component level, to actually use my schooling to engineer circuit layouts. And then work with a manufacturing company that, had a group of people assembling these things. And it was interesting because we would take the lid off the computer, the monitor, and take the chip out and put our board where that chip was. And so we kind of supercharged those terminals.
Okay.
And supervised doing all that, managed doing all that. And then we'd go put them in restaurants and show people how to use them. And they were just amazed at the time they could save doing that,
I imagine.
And so then shortly on the heels of that, I went to work for TWA as a true service technician in the IT department, managing all the stuff you see at the airport, the boarding pass printers, before you had your phone, the paper documents, everything they needed to fly and everything. So it was very interesting, the hands-on level.
Right.
But I'm also a very hands-on person. I got in trouble as a child for taking the car door apart because the crank up knob went this way instead of this way. I couldn't figure out why it was different than all the other cars my dad and mom had. You know, mom
Oh,
especially was upset because it was her new car. So,
you were able to put it
all
back
she
together at
said
least?
was just put it back together. I don't ever want to, So I came back in the house an hour later and said, well, I know how it works now. And she goes, please don't do that again. So, but I have that
Oh,
kind of mind, that very inquisitive. How does it work?
okay.
What's beneath the covers? So I think that's what served me well in my career was when I worked with people that used our computers, I didn't just say type ABC enter. It's like, this is what's going to happen. Here's why it works. This is what you're actually calling. This is what you're doing. And they seemed to accept that better because they felt like they had more control
Right.
over just, okay, the manual says ABC enter.
Right. Otherwise, it's just magic or witchcraft.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Like, why would I mess with something I don't understand?
Exactly. So, kind of a long way on your question, but I think I got to the bottom line for you.
Hey, that works. We
Yeah.
like the circuitous route.
Yes.
So, what was it that initially drew you to the field of computers, aside from just understanding that or believing that it was going to, where basically it is today?
Yeah. Well, and back to my father. He said, go learn computers and you'll be a better farmer.
Okay.
You'll come home, and then when that finally comes along in this industry, you'll be able to manage that. And so, just simple things that farmers do today with GPS and guidance. And, last year I harvested more crop in this part of the field than this. The other part of the field needs more fertilizer, more water, so they can highly manage that kind of thing. The other thing was just the ultimate challenge that it was brand new. I mean, I already told you it was very mechanical and taking car doors apart and overhauling Volkswagen engines in high school. And it just seemed like the next big challenge that was on the horizon,
Okay.
and I haven't been scared of too many things in life. And so I just jumped in with both feet. Back to my mother's chagrins, I didn't go learn programming because that was very stable. That was going to guarantee job. They're hiring at the military, the government, and all this. And
Right. Right.
he's going to do what? So, but once they warmed up to the idea, I think they truly endorsed it, and fully supported it for sure.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So when if you would see someone starting off today getting into the general area of computers
Mhm.
and wanting to specialize in this, where do you think they should start looking, or what do you think they should perhaps have with them, or inside them before they move on to this?
Move on to that. I think probably the easiest one to speak to is like someone who develops web pages. You have to have a full understanding of why the screen does that when you tab around and hit, and that type of thing. But it also allows you to have that creativity. And so being a webmaster, if you will,
Mhm.
you get to do a little of your own personality, your own little twist and that kind of thing. Now, your customer may say, I want a red and black background and I want blue letters and all that. But as far as being able to kind of put the web page together for somebody and that, there's a lot of creativity to that. And again, that's a job where a person could be very creative, in doing that. Having an understanding towards, like I did, how do things actually work, and in a ABC type of approach. I think that applies all the way from automotive to HVAC to all these other industries that use computers too, because you need to have that understanding at that basic level. If a person does it and a computer just does it better, faster, and more reliable and never has a sick day, you still need to know how to do it to be able to work with the computers if even someone else built the computer for you. So depending on what level of the IT industry you want to be a part of, whether it's at the grassroots, the engineering level, actually designing and making computers, or more of the user interface side, or even the personalized stuff like the webmasters and that domain level, I know now, and I retired right before AI really took off. But I know that some of the people that worked in our web pages and, customer.com websites that we help support, and again, it was the travel industry. So airline.com, hotels, and then some of the brokerage firms like Expedia, Orbitz, Priceline. All of those were our customers because we housed the main data, but they all displayed the data a little different. They put their own brand on it. They put their own spin on it,
Right.
So I think the beauty of the IT industry today is it is so wide reaching, left to right, top to bottom. You can kind of find your niche just like you maybe would have 100 years ago. Do you want to be more of the manual labor? Do you want to be more of the management level? Do you want to be more the service oriented, or do you want to be more of the independent contractor type? So I don't know. That's a tough question.
Options.
It's a broad subject, no pun intended, just because it's involved in everything.
Right. When someone is looking to understand let's say the environment that one would work in computers. I mean, you're talking about multiple different companies, multiple different corp.
Mhm.
There's so many different ways it could go. So many different contractors or people who are looking to commission work from you.
Right.
Can you speak on some of the experiences of interactions with these entities that one might be working with in this field?
Yeah, and I think back when I first started doing the service organization, I literally got in my car and came to you because you had the computer that either needed attention or service or maintenance or whatever. And again, you got to remember this is long before video phone calls, long before think tanks, if you will. So my career in the 80s changed a little bit because it was it's interesting to say it this way, but you may not relate to this, but an older generation would. It was the IBM mentality. White shirts, thin ties, everybody's wearing a suit.
Right.
Ladies are in dress pants, ladies are, all this kind of stuff. And we were all in the office 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. No exceptions, because that's how you got things done, was collaborating in the office, right? Well, the interesting thing that happened towards the end of my career was telecommuting, and we used to always joke in meetings, don't stand up, because half the people were wearing their pajamas and their fuzzy slippers, but they looked nice from the waist up in the video, and so how you interacted with people, was totally different at the end of my career too. But especially in the 70s and the 80s, it was all about in the office. It was all about the collaboration. We all went to lunch together, talked about last weekend, the concert we went to, where'd you go on your trip, you're planning a vacation, that camaraderie thing, And, my wife and I have been married 40 plus years, but I spent more waking hours with my coworkers than I did her because I was at work 7, 8 hours straight. And we were, very engaged in doing that. Whereas I'd come home and we'd do things in the evening and off to bed and,
Wake up and roll out. Yeah.
And granted weekends and everything. But I think the expectation in today's world is much different than what I saw in the 70s and the 80s. Now I understand the climate is more back in the office with some flexible scheduling, maybe 4 10-hour days instead of 5 8-hour days. And ultimately, I've already kind of told you I worked in a service organization my whole career. The lights never went out. We were 24/7 forever, as I used to say.
Right.
And so there was always someone there monitoring the computers and the systems and the data and everything and the components it took to make it available, regardless.
Just in case.
Right. Or doing maintenance work or whatever, So we always had a group of a dozen or so people, whether it was Christmas Day or New Year's Eve or 4th of July, And my friends that worked in HR weren't a 24-hour mindset. So they had a real hard time understanding why someone who worked 12 hours on July 4th should really get a day and a half off somewhere, people, because they worked and you were on holiday and they did a 12-hour shift, Wow. But so I think the key to, at least what I'm trying to get back to for your question is, I think depending on the type of interface that you end up with the IT industry will definitely drive the demand of, are you getting up and driving into the office every day? Do you have a fixed schedule? Is it more of an on-demand thing? Do you want to work midnights? They're going to hire people that work straight midnights,
Mhm.
And it turns out now you can go get groceries on your day off at 2 a.m. if you want to.
Wow, nice. Yeah.
So,
Keep your sleep schedule.
yeah, you do. You don't have to flip back and forth. Back in the day, the guys on midnights would go on vacation to Vegas because they stayed up all night. And they were just thrilled when the local grocery store was open 24 hours. So they didn't have to go shopping in the middle of their sleep time,
Right.
because if you've ever worked shifts, you can't switch back and forth and be happy. I'm sorry, you can't sleep 5 days a week and 2 nights a week. It just doesn't work. If you can, my hat's off to you. So
So it sounds like this field is big into customer service, A,
Mhm.
and then B, perhaps odd hours if you're on that, I guess, kind of reactionary
Or the support side,
support
maybe
side.
say, yeah.
All right.
Because if your computer starts goofing up, you don't want to wait till Monday morning at 8 a.m.
Right.
You're going to call somebody. Now,
Especially if you're one of these airlines that's running 24/7.
now the person you talk to, it may be 2 in the afternoon, but they're halfway around the planet because they do shift support centers as follow the sun was kind of the term we always used. We had our help desk in the United States open during the day. Then we shifted to Asia Pacific. Then we shifted to Europe. Then we came back to the U.S. And so we had three customer support centers, and they all went to work during their normal daytime. We found it was very productive that way. Their personal lives, their work life, and the biggest challenge was handing off problems to the next continent, if I can say it that way.
How, may I ask how that worked?
It actually worked very well. Where we got in trouble was we tried to do it on a 12-hour swing. And so now, unless you look at, excuse me, someone that's in the Americas, and 12 hours off is what? Australia, just to make it easy.
Singapore, Australia.
Yeah, Singapore area. So if you did that, it was fine because you had the same guy relieving you, gal or lady, sorry, relieving you that then you came back and relieved, right? There was none of this, well, that was 2 people ago,
Ah,
So you had the continuity there
so that was one upswing.
with the support. Now, as we got more mature in our computer ticketing type systems and tracking systems, it worked well to do the 8-hour shift because you had notes and ledgers and who did what and how they do this. And, because ultimately it seemed like a lot of those things specific to the airline did require someone going on site and working on that terminal at gate 22 or whatever it was, So, but I think the beauty of a service organization specifically, even if it's in a hospital setting, is they're 24/7, and it seems like you always find a person or a skill set that can fit that shift, If you can't tell, I had a really hard time sleeping during the day. So I
can imagine.
I always argued for day shift, So especially with the family.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in hiring individuals, what would you say that management is looking for? Are they looking for a particular demeanor or a particular skill set? What kind of education are they looking for in this field in computers?
Yeah, and I think, and again, across my career, I saw this swing both ways because at one point in time, it didn't matter how much experience you had, but you had to have the education.
Right.
And I think then management learned later in life, if you will, if I can say it that way, it's actually more valuable to have a good blend. You need to have some education, but what's more important is that you have the experience.
Right.
Now, there were very few candidates or employees who had no education, but had tons of experience, but they were out there. They were just those type of individuals that learned that job and those skills and took over for that, But I think back to your question, especially in a service organization, customer is always king. Now, the customer isn't always right, but you got to do everything in your power to make them think they were at least right. Even though you get to tell them they're so full of stuff, it's not fun.
Yep.
There can always be a pain, right?
Okay. Yep.
But to that same point, it's just like your boss. What's your manager going to be looking for? Someone who's responsible and knowledgeable and can communicate well. Because regardless of what you're doing, there's always going to be a project status. There's always going to be a trouble update. There's always going to be something that you need to communicate throughout the ranks. And ultimately, the number one rule was always, is my boss happy? If my boss asked me to do something, that should be one of the very first things I do today. It should be my priority, you know. Now, a good boss will understand I'm picking up from the last crew, or I'm working this project to finish it through. But that was kind of the golden rule when I worked, was always make sure your manager, your boss's boss, is happy. Because if that's the case, then things are in pretty good shape, you know. But I think the willingness to learn, you know, because I've already several times mentioned how much has changed since the 70s. But our lives, we like to measure on an annual basis. I'm going to be 67 years old, right? Okay. I just turned 21. The thing about computers is an internet year worked itself down to where it was only about 3 months long. Oh. So in a physical calendar year, trip around the sun kind of deal.
Because things are changing that quickly.
The internet and the computers were growing so fast, you had to be very nimble too. You couldn't just say, oh, I'll learn that next year. Well, it turns out next year is like in a couple of months when it moves that quickly, you know. I haven't read lately how quickly the internet is progressing, but there for the longest time, it was an internet year was a quarter. The internet year was 5 times a year. Then it would back to a quarter, you know. But it wouldn't surprise me now if it isn't still as quick.
Right.
You know, you think about all the technology that comes out, just, I mean, sitting in this room, televisions and laptops and everything else.
So it sounds like computers were trying to race dogs for who would age the quickest.
Yes, exactly. And how quick. And then, you know, yesterday's news is yesterday's news. As soon as everybody gets the 5G cell phone, nobody wants the old 3G cell phone anymore, right? You know, and
I always thought those worked better.
Well,
or more reliable.
A little more reliable, you know. Yeah. And we could have a conversation for a couple of hours about planned obsolescence, but I think manufacturers know that things grow at a high rate too. So they're always trying to look at N+1 was a term we used a lot. Let's plan for N+1, N being the normal, where we're at today.
And then having some adaptability after that.
What are we going to do when this comes around the corner here in a month or two? And yeah, so not in summary, because we're not there yet, but I think you've got to be obviously knowledgeable, either through education or hands-on or a little mix of both, right? And you've also got to be very motivated, because the world will leave you behind if you just sit on your laurels. And then as a prospective employee, I think you always have to think about, who am I actually working for? Who is signing my paycheck? Who is going to do my annual review and say exceeds expectations or just meets expectations, you know? Because there aren't many people who stay around who don't meet expectations. There's a legion of people ready to come in and try to exceed expectations, right?
So super highly competitive.
Very competitive.
Workspace.
Yeah. And, you know, I had several people I worked with for 20 years who just decided to coast. And next thing you know, they were unemployed and they just didn't understand why. And, you know, I actually went to lunch with them, and one of them, and I said, what got you this job? Oh, man, I was on fire, and I was working so hard, and I was learning and everything else. And I said, so who do you think took your job? Someone who's on fire and learning and working very hard. And, you know, and they actually admitted, they said, yeah, I shouldn't have coasted. I didn't, you know, nothing is guaranteed, you know. And
so that's the thing that's definitely going to have to keep up through an entire career, is just constant learning, constant adaptation, constant moving and shaking, basically.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm sort of the unicorn in this whole conversation, because I worked for the same company for 37 years. Now, that company was bought out and acquired and all those, but I literally went to the same job for 37 years, you know. Well, with all the turmoil in the industry and all the advancement and the automation in the industry, it turns out not every job's like that. Most of the people who stayed and worked someplace for a very long time were more interested in the vacation accruement and that kind of thing.
Yes.
And then, but there's a fun little technique I learned in management when we were hiring people. The one time you get to negotiate your start of work, salary, benefit package, and all that is when you're interviewing for your job. Once you have the job, now you fall into the guidelines. And so what I mean by that is if you're thinking about switching jobs, but you don't want to because you've earned up, now I'm getting 3 weeks vacation every year and all that, just go to the new job and demand you get a 3-week vacation starting point. What's the worst thing that happens? They don't hire you because HR won't let them do that. But if you're valuable enough to that company, they'll make that exception. And then it's a win-win. You get a bigger, better job with more challenges, and you keep your 3 weeks vacation.
Right. And
So-
speaking of switching jobs, what about how do companies feel about that?
A lot of jobs, people realize that they bounce around,
Mhm.
right? And, you've heard people say about, oh, here's my resume. Well, if I were to have applied for a new job at the end of my career, my resume would have been very short. I would have spent a lot of time on my resume talking about the 70s and then my first jobs in the 80s. And then I've worked here since 87. But then, of course, your resume says, well, what have you done since you've been here? Went from service tech to lead to a manager and, that kind of thing. But I think in the industry, it's almost accepted that you're going to move around. A lot of it depends, though. I think on the engineering side, it's like, yeah, engineers are a dime a dozen kind of thing. Let's find somebody that can do the job or is looking for what we need. But when it comes to a service organization like I ended up retiring from, I used that knowledge that I had gained since the late 80s about the airline and the travel industry to help address my customers' complaints and questions. And they knew I kind of grew up through the IT phase of it. And so, but back to your question, I think in today's world, especially computer companies and different management levels, almost kind of expect people are going to bounce around, But again, I sat on both sides of that fence, and there was some people when I hired them, I thought they were the best thing, and I was really glad when they got a new job because then I didn't have to take care of disciplinary stuff, And then there's other people that I begged them not to go anywhere just because they were so valuable, but they just didn't feel fulfilled. And so you can't get in the way of somebody that thinks that way either.
What are some of the causes for those feelings of fulfillment and not being fulfilled?
Some people got tired of the grind, And again, we were being a support organization. We dealt a lot with, specifically in the airlines. And I know you've never been there, but you're sitting in the gate area and someone announces the computers are down. We can't board. We're not going to, Well, you don't want to be at the front line standing there with the smile and your airline badge going, I'm sorry, but the computers are broke. They're working on it, And some people just didn't like the pressure of that, And then on the back at the data center side of that, there was always that we got to rush. We can't have flight delays attributed to this or whatever, or outages, that kind of thing. Excuse me. But I think the biggest thing is just having the awareness of what am I here for? If I'm a webmaster and my commitment to my contract is I'm going to do a web page a month, well, go for it. Go have fun. Do whatever you have. Just deliver in March. Right? Mm-hmm. But if you're more of the service organization and you say, I want to have all my problems resolved under 10 minutes and all this and not have flight delays or whatever, again, I'm being very airline centric here. So I don't know. I think part of that is the satisfaction of the job well done. We always try to keep stats on trouble tickets. How long did they languish? Were they addressed? Was it something that was procedural? Can we update a procedure and make it shorter next time? That type of approach. Yeah. So
when dealing with the customers, what kind of positives and minuses are there? Positive interactions, negative interactions? Are there sometimes challenges working with customers?
Oh, for sure. I mean, because let's just be honest, customers are people. And since they are paying for a service, ergo they're a customer, they feel a little entitled, and they say, "Wait a minute, I'm giving you $1. How come I'm only getting 50 cents worth of stuff here? What's going on?" Whether that's a problem or an outage or, some kind of issue. And so I think the biggest thing I learned in dealing with customers is walk a mile in their shoe, right?
Right.
Have the empathy for the fact of what they're doing, and then be bold and brave enough to call them out when they're just out of left field or something. And whether you do that in a joking fashion or if it's in a big quarterly business meeting, you have to be firm and just say, that's not what the contract says. Do we need to review that?
Right.
But I think you have to earn a customer's trust and have that level of camaraderie, that level of trust again. But at the same time, they're going to walk all over you if you're not firm and follow the law, And
Right.
and so, I was always a nice guy, but I learned quickly that nice guys don't finish first. You have to follow the rules, you have to follow the guidelines. If you're always doing a customer a favor and cutting them some slack and letting them get by with it, well, then that's what they're going to do all the time. So it's a two-way street, I guess is the biggest thing. Respect, because the reason they're in their job at the customer's location is because they're working with a service provider. They have to answer to their bosses and their accountants. Why are we paying this amount of money for what we're using, And so it was a very delicate balance, Specific to the travel industry, and we've already alluded to it a couple of times, but the absolute worst thing that happened is things break to where people can't travel. Planes don't move, buses don't go, trains are stopped, hotels can't sell rooms. I mean, the whole thing. And
We've seen that a few times.
Yes. And so other than weather, nobody wants to hear about flight delay because we've yet to figure out how to avoid the weather stuff. So you just deal with it, But that was the biggest thing. And now you will see that even today. It catches my eye when I see on the news that there's a ground stop because there's a huge computer outage. Airline ABC can't board, they can't fly, they can't go anywhere. And you see the lines, the TV pictures, the lines out the terminal. Everybody's standing outside waiting to rebook a flight, or what are we going to do? That kind of thing. And that whole process changed dramatically when everybody got a smartphone. Because if you haven't done it, you should. While you're waiting in line to talk to an agent, you're on your phone going, what's going to be my plan? Do I want to fly to LA to get there versus going direct or something,
Right.
that we can help provide your own solution.
Right. So let's say instead of going from here to Montreal, I want to go from here to Newark to.
And then second leg into Montreal, But is it the last flight? And what if Montreal's full? And am I going to spend the night in New York? So I get all those questions that you would ask someone at a counter, So, but I think that's the biggest thing with customers is, you have to say customer's king. Customer's always right to an extent, though,
Right.
And that's why they have lovely departments called customer service and resolution centers. And it's people with a little more patience than I, let's just say it that way.
Okay.
And maybe a little more power to kind of squash the concern. And because, not every customer is a pound of flesh, but they got to tell their boss, well, this is broke and this is what they're going to do.
Right.
Right. And so that was really my main job for the last 10, 15 years of my career was not only providing updates while there were problems, but then doing what we call post-mortem reporting and go back to our customer and say, here's what we're doing so that issue won't happen again.
Right.
This is what we're doing to make life better for you in the event it were to happen again.
Okay. So explain the corrective actions.
Yes.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have to smile and say, now, that was the good news. Here's the bad news. We're going to have to take some downtime to correct things. Can we coordinate the best time with you when we can take this out of service?
So scheduling, planning.
Schedule the maintenance kind of thing.
Okay.
And now we're back to our midnight shift people because almost all of those were out of prime time, wherever the customer base was,
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you think, and it's not so much anymore, but brick and mortar travel agencies in the 80s, hundreds of agents manning phone banks, sitting in an office building in St. Louis and selling tickets on TWA and cruises and packages and travel plans. And,
Right.
you know,
And
and
now
so
it's
if they're all sitting around waiting for the computers to come back up, then, so yeah, that's a very complex industry, but I don't view it any different than a support organization for your brand new car. Go to the dealer, got to get parts, there's recalls, there's regular maintenance.
Mhm.
It's just a little more dynamic. It makes the news a little more when there's hundreds of people and hundreds of flights. And
Right.
you
Unless
know,
there's something crazy going on with that recall.
yes, very crazy. Then everybody goes and buys a different kind of car.
Generally,
Yeah,
yes. There's a few brands that have gone defunct because
they
of
have.
that.
Yes, very much so.
So, when someone is starting off this career, what are some of the things that perhaps they should focus on in the computer realm? Particular aims they should have or plans that they have in place for their progression in this field?
I think, again, since I'm a nuts and bolts person, I think that a thorough understanding of how all this works. It's not just the guy behind the mirror or the curtain. Everything just happens. Now, how does it happen? You know, um, I could tell you stories of undersea transmission cables getting disrupted and us having to bounce data off a satellite. It was slower because it's a lot farther to go to a satellite and back than it was a direct shot undersea, but it was still working. So we had to make sure our customer base knew, yes, things are a little slower, but running on a backup route. You saw in the news where a big ship dug up an undersea cable and severed all the communications from, Australia to Singapore or whatever. And so just having that innate knowledge to be able to either self understand what's going on to better approach how would I correct this, I think is very important versus just it's the guy behind the curtain. It's magic. They say it'll be up on Tuesday, kind of thing. I don't know. But again, that's just me coming from my background. I think the number one thing for me was always to understand how things worked, you know. And so I built my career on doing the installations, doing the configurations, doing the maintenance. And then later in my career, I worked with the customers and other people did the installations and that. But I could at least speak to my customer about this is what we're doing behind the scenes. It's just not magic. This is what we're doing to make it better. Duplicate data storage and alternate paths and the ability to bounce off a satellite versus saying, oh, well, once they fix the cable, we'll get you back in business.
Explaining to them that you have a backup plan makes them
Right.
feel more comfortable with the situation and
For sure.
understanding that, hey, this is not going to just be bad for a long time.
And so I think for someone getting in the industry, obviously you may not know exactly what you want to do, but kind of follow your heart. If you're like me and you just got to know what's under the covers, open the hood, how's it work, focus on that and learn that. If you're more of the, well, it works, I just need to know how to make it quicker, more efficient for my customer, But I think to some extent, we've all become computer IT specialists. You've probably done no less than a dozen updates to your iPhone software. You've probably done no less than several firmware updates to your smart TV, that kind of thing. So the industry has made it very easy for the end users to self-manage that
Yeah,
stuff.
all we have to do is click accept.
Yeah. And how many years ago was it such a hassle to get a new phone? You had to engage someone and they had to take your IMEI number and update your record and all that. Well, now you just get online
It's a
and you say, I
2-hour
got a new phone.
process.
I bought a new phone. Yay. Do it yourself, And to me, that's part of the behind the scenes computer stuff that makes life easier, more efficient, I think we could talk for hours about the paradox of how computers have made people dumber. They've dummied down people because there's just, you hit the button and it works and it always goes, And I know it's kind of an obtuse example, but I say this all the time. I said, when I was a kid, I had a dime in my pocket and 100 phone numbers in my head. Now I am lucky to remember the number to call my phone when I misplace it so I can look up your phone number.
Ah,
You and I talk enough. I would have known your number in the 70s. I'm going to call Derek, but now it's like, I got to go find this number because I don't.
right.
But did we replace the memory and what we used in our brain with something different? I think so. We replaced with how to get it done versus I have to do it myself manually. It's kind of a weird paradox. I don't know if it helps answer your question, but
It's kind of a shifting of how we use the information that we store,
yeah,
or what kind of information we store because of how we store it,
How we
how we
store
use
it.
the information.
right. And Hollywood and TV has done a really good job of trying to represent where we may go with computers someday.
Mhm.
And you've got to remember when I was a kid, the Jetsons was a thing. They had a robot made. Well, I kicked the vacuum the other day and said, I want you to go down the hall and vacuum, So it's all in where we're at, what we do with it. So, but I don't know. I think the biggest thing in some ways it's really scary. I don't know if this is helpful. But in some ways it's really scary because there's so many different places that IT can take you in this world in 2026. But then the optimistic side of me goes, but there's so many different places it can take you. You have so many more choices. You know, back when, at least when I was a kid, and I suspect when you were, what do you want to be when you grow up? A fireman, a nurse, a doctor, a cowboy. I mean, maybe you're a rock star. I mean, who knows? You never heard anybody say, I want to be a computer dude,
Right.
But now I think kids do that. They say, I want to grow up and be a programmer. I want to be a
So-
webmaster. I want to grow up and be, the idea of going in the office every day, I just work from home, start my own business, do a publishing company,
Yeah.
do data warehousing. I mean, there's 1,000 different jobs, and I'm being very understating with that. But then there's also room for, and you've heard all the fuss about data centers,
Huge in
Well,
the news right now.
Data centers aren't dark. They have people that work there and they have to run the power and the facility, let alone manage the systems, do the maintenance, do the installs. So there's always a job if you want to kind of be behind the scenes,
Right.
And then if you want to be IT based and be on the front lines, then you go visit doctor's offices with this is new software that helps your patients with their medicine and this and that. And so there's still all those jobs that are quote unquote IT based, and you have to have that innate understanding of at least how it works to be able to speak to it. Yeah.
So, David, speaking of data centers, what are your thoughts on the kind of boom of data centers that's going on
Well,
now?
it's interesting where we sit here in my wife and I's living room. Less than a mile from here, there was a big proposal to put up a data center,
Hmm.
and I was all for it because I'm wise enough to know that 102 acre property is going to sell someday. It's been a farm since it's been a farm. I mean, this is kind of a rural part of Atlanta. It's grown more, suburbanite and industrial as time has gone on. But something was going to happen to that 200 acres, right? The family, all the kids, nobody wanted to live there anymore, so they decided to sell it. Well, an investor bought it, and they came in with a very good plan that I thought for a data center. And people were worried about how noisy it was going to be. They were worried about how much water it may consume. They were worried about what's it going to look like from the road, And the only reason I know that is I went to a couple of the hearings, and some people were just over the top, And if it wasn't for the fact I was a little worried about people on our back porch with pitchforks and torches, I was ready to stand up and go, hey, I've worked in a data center for 30 years. Everything you guys are talking about isn't right. It's no.
So, what are some of the answers to those questions that they were bringing up?
Well, just as a paradox, they were very worried about water consumption
Right.
because a lot of computers and servers and all that are water cooled, but they're closed loop systems. So what that means is they don't run cool water in the top of them, and then the water runs out on the ground.
It gets
It's
recirculated.
circulated, and it's like the car radiator. You don't have to stop every time you get gas and fill up your car radiator,
Mhm.
you know. And so I actually talked to one of the water department employees because they said, no, we're ready. We've got the capacity. There is a big demand when you go to fill up the system, right? Initially, but there's no evaporation or anything like that with these, the modern day. Now, data centers 30 years ago had cooling towers. And so you had some evaporation and you had to replenish that. But I just flat out asked him, I said, 4 miles from that proposed data center is a middle school complex. I said, Monday morning about 9:30, what's the water consumption during the first break classes? And he just looked at me, he goes, man, I wish you would get up and tell these people this stuff. So I don't think that there's a huge demand on the water supply.
Okay.
I truly don't. Power, you have to engineer it right. Yes, there may be more transmission lines overhead, but where this location was right at the foot of a transmission path that's already installed. I mean, they did their homework. And as far as what's it look like? Well, it looks like a big building, commercial building, 2 stories tall and 100-foot long, 200-foot long, and it sits back from the road, and they planted green, and they had a parking lot. And oh, what about employees? Well, okay, it takes 6 or 7 employees a day to have one person there all the time, day shift, night shift, evenings, a couple of vacation people,
Right.
7 days weekend. You can get by with it. You need 7 or 8 people
To have the nice
to
rotation.
really have the rotation. People get vacations and everything. I said, so you're maybe talking about 15 or 20 cars in the parking lot. So the paradox that I finally had to just kind of boil it down to was either they're going to build a subdivision on that 200 acres with 200 houses, 200 minivans in and out, soccer moms, buses, trash trucks, the whole thing, or it's going to be a truck warehouse depot. Because those are what's very popular here south of Atlanta with all the shipping and the store, the warehousing.
Right.
I said, which would you rather have? Would you rather have a building that hums gently through the night and just the lights are always on and they're always there? Or do you want the housing? Do you want all of the pollution that comes with people? Or do you want rumbling trucks sitting at loading docks? And of course, I'm being a little dramatic, right? But at the end of the day, what I think is interesting is, like a lot of other things in life, everybody wants a data center. Everybody needs a data center. They just don't want it in their backyard.
Right.
Just like we've got to have a power plant. We've got to have a fire station. We've got to have a school.
It's part of the infrastructure.
It's part of the infrastructure.
Internet.
And if
data
you
getting
want to
transferred.
go to Atlanta, you got to have an interstate. You got to have access roads, and but not in my backyard. So I personally think, and this is editorial comment. Sorry, I'm going to go off on a rant here.
It's all right.
They didn't approve the data center, but they will. In a year or two, it'll come back, and then people kind of realize, it's not that big a deal, and the tax money and the environmental offsets, and it doesn't look bad. And I truly think that project will come back to fruition. Just because the people that did the engineering did their homework again. It's got power.
And they're addressing the customer concerns.
It's got water. It's got the real estate, and they're addressing those concerns. One of the things that I just thought was just totally ridiculous was they talked about the noise level.
Yes.
And I was like,
what's really happening?
I went
with
to
that?
work every single day for 37 years in one, and I don't ever remember it being noisy. Get out of my car in the parking lot, and there was, obviously landscaping and trees and birds and grass. And so I don't understand that.
Right. Because the noise, I'm guessing, is mostly contained within the building.
In the building, yeah. And though there may be a little bit of noise if there's a big power outage and they start some diesel generator for an hour or two a year, if we have that level of service from the power provider. But I also know once a month for insurance and sanity reasons, you do a 5-minute test. So do you have the generators run 5 minutes and that bothers you? I, I don't know. Again, I'm rather biased because I grew up and lived in that environment. But my wife wouldn't let me go to the next hearing. She goes, "You're going to get in trouble." It's just write your
Calm down.
congressman or something, you know. So,
Right.
and I joke about the pitchforks and torches on the back porch. I think I'm not sure. Some of those folks were very passionate, you know,
As many people are in
as many
public
people
hearings,
are.
yes.
And you know, I've heard a lot of this, not just in Georgia. I've heard a lot of this turmoil over data centers in the Northeast, New Jersey, Virginia, you know, and the thing about it is we can build a data center almost anywhere on this planet now. As long as we got power and communications and a workforce to support it, it could be out in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, where I grew up. I mean, if that's where you want to put a data center. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on data centers.
All right. Well, thank you.
Go get a job in a data center. You won't regret it. No, I'm just kidding. But you know. So,
Well, David, question about finding a job. So when somebody's going into the workforce, where are just a couple of the places? I mean, I know IT work or computer work is everywhere, but if someone really wants to get straight into this after high school, college, what are some of the places they could get a start?
yeah, and I think it kind of comes back to it's no different than in the 60s. You got to decide, do I want to work in the healthcare organization, service, retail, support side, et cetera? Because again, like we've talked about tonight, those jobs are everywhere. So if you just have a passion for childcare, but you're learning computers, well, go find a job in a healthcare organization. Go find a job in a childcare organization that utilizes computers. You know, um, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it because I think it's kind of like saying, oh, I don't know, it's kind of obscure. If I wanted to have a job and I want to be outside all the time, no matter what, every day, rain, shine, the whole thing, I love it. Well, you're kind of limiting yourself to landscaping, construction, right? That kind of thing. Versus, oh no, I want an office job. I want a desk job. Well, there's millions of opportunities for office work, right? Whether it's on the service side, working at an insurance company or working for healthcare or working for, records or government jobs kind of thing, you know. So I think the fun thing about computers being so widespread left and right is you kind of got to find your niche, what do you really want to do in life, and do it with computers, if that makes sense. I think if you were to say, okay, I just want to work on computers, I want to do IT. Well, the very next quick question is going to be, well, what type of IT? You know? And so it kind of settles itself in the wash, if you will. Those two things end up at the same result. You kind of got to decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to be very involved in people? Because let's be honest, there are people who need jobs who aren't very good with people. You know, they work well in small groups, they work well here, but maybe not customer facing, per se. Customer complaints down the hall kind of thing, But I think that the biggest challenge, I think that folks that are either just starting out in the industry or looking to move to the computer side of things, now that computers are everywhere, is making those decisions of what type of job do I want to have, And again, not to lament the fact that computers are doing everything, but I think it's almost kind of a second nature because you're going to do computers if you get a job in 2026. It's just, what industry is it? Mm-hmm. What part of the computer, Is it more the end user, more of the development side, the IT? Yeah. So I'm probably not the best to answer that question just because
this is a hard question.
It is a
because
very
there's
hard
so
question.
much going on there.
Yeah.
It's like asking which blade of grass out in your lawn is the favorite.
Right. The one that the sun shines on, kind of thing. So I don't know. I'm trying to kind of put it back in perspective of when I started school and what was I going to do. Computers was almost kind of a way out there thing, you know, because you either went to school and you focused on education or professional, whether you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, or dentist, whatever, very, very vertical class structure for that. But at the end of the day, everybody took the course. Everybody took the core subjects, right? And to me now, the core is the computers, the industry. Everybody should learn IT, kind of get back to that. And then how do you use it in your life? And unfortunately, one size doesn't fit all. Some people are very, very good at the nuts and bolts, or the ones and zeros, if you will, in computers. And other people are more of the, no, I just need to know how to use it. I don't need to know what's behind the scenes. Right. How can I be efficient at,
interacting with this device or program?
And, thinking of AI coming towards us, again, in my mind, and I've got a very tainted view on AI, I think, because in my mind, if we can't do it as people, how do we ever train a computer to do it? Mm-hmm. Well, now I've had several people tell me, oh boy, you're just not up there with it. Computers are so smart now that we can get them to where they can learn how to train bigger computers and people aren't needed. Because all you have to do is set the task.
And just daisy chaining the education
for
computers. And they'll
figure out how to do a better job, And I get that. I see that. But I still think at the end of the day, there's a guy with the power cord going, no. This isn't what we wanted you to do, But AI is a very powerful thing, And it's kind of like, I talked earlier about think tanks, especially at engineering companies. Put 30 college engineers in a room and have them go build a widget, right? The better widget, not just a widget. We have a widget. We want a better widget, And I get the fact that if they can do the grunt work with a computer and let AI grind all the data and do all the hard part, then they can focus more on the ideals or that right. Kind of thing. Things that I don't think computers are good at as people still.
Yes.
Now, there are some people that argue that computers are better at that than us because they're not logical and they don't have favorites and they don't have, I like blue better than green.
We found that that's not completely true, though.
No, that is. So
it's based on what they've been trained on, and then they start developing tendencies towards leaning towards those things.
Yeah. So what was the sci-fi thing? HAL, I think, was the name of the computer. Yes. That just went haywire, went bonkers because he learned quicker than the people managing it couldn't even understand what HAL was doing. And that was supposed to be the big sci-fi IT terror of the day, Trying to think when that was. I guess that was in the 80s, late 80s, 90s.
I can't remember exactly.
But anyway, we digress. I'm sorry.
So where do you see the future of the industry going? I mean, clearly there's the AI boom, but there's also development in technology. But do you have kind of a projection of where things will be in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, and that is so hard to say. I think often, I mentioned my grandfather. He was born in the late 1880s. He went to town in a horse and buggy. He saw the automobile come along, airplanes. And before he passed in the late 70s, he watched a man walk on the moon. And I think of in his lifetime, 80 years, that happened. Well, in my lifetime, I was there when they walked on the moon, and now they're going to Mars and they're doing this and all the IT and the computers. So where are we headed with all this? I think ultimately, as people, we'll still be in charge. It's just all the grunt work, all the grind work, all the mundane things that go into engineering and design and all that. Wasn't that long ago they were making next year's car model out of clay just to have a conceptual visual model to show people. Well, now on computers with engineering and 3D reckoning and all that, they don't have to have a 500-pound pot, wad of clay for the next Camaro. They just
Digitally
put it on the
conceptualize it.
computer
Yeah.
and said, "Do you want the fender taller or shorter?" So I think the biggest challenge is not maybe where the the industry is going, but how do we as people manage where it's going to go? How do we guide those supercomputers, that AI, all that business to do the work more efficiently and better for the good of all mankind, per se, right?
So
Yeah.
someone jumping into this career, I mean, basically you're hitting the ground running. So what's the best way to hit the ground running?
Yeah. I see moms handing their kids phones to keep them busy. And in a lot of ways that's kind of weird. But at the same time, even you and our children, your age, don't know anything but computers. Our kids, Rose and I's kids, were very fortunate when they were 4 and 5. I had a work from home terminal. And of course, I went and found some games and I sat them down in front of it. And so they weren't afraid of a computer. That was dad's work computer and we got to
Right.
play games on it, but it wasn't foreign to them because I knew this industry was just going to go bonkers, you know. And so I think, people that are, especially if you're just coming out of high school or coming out of a tech school in that level and trying to work through this, you've been around a computer your whole life.
Mhm.
The key to this is how do we best manage it? How do we best utilize it? You know, um, learning programming, learning how to build web pages, be a webmaster, what's behind the scenes, more efficient, doesn't use as much memory. All of those things are big challenges in the industry because anybody can just throw more mud on the wall, right? But if you can make it to where you're using less components and less electricity and it's smaller and it fits in your pocket, then guess what people are going to want to use?
That
The
thing.
more convenient thing. And it's more efficient. It'll have a better life expectancy too because of its efficiency.
Mm.
You know, think about the original cell phones, size of a carry-on bag with an antenna, bag phones, let alone who would have thought my flip phone would someday turn into a personal computer. I assume me, like most people, spend a whole lot less time on a traditional laptop or desktop than they do on their smartphone.
I've definitely made or felt the transition from, okay, I'm mostly using internet on computer back in the day to dial up, dating myself as well,
Yeah.
to finally getting a smart computer that I could access my email and Facebook on, had a little keyboard on it.
Right.
And then, but I was still mostly using a computer because that was so slow.
Right.
And then now
almost
it's,
everything's on a smartphone.
yeah, now it's reverse.
You think back at, again, the industry I worked in, you would plan your family vacation by going to a travel agency, looking at brochures,
Physical brochures,
talking to a physical agent who'd kind of give you the ins and outs, not just you're going to need a passport, ma'am, to go to Mexico, but, all the stuff. And then they'd have a little brochure of a hotel, right? Well, now you get on your phone and you flip through and go, I don't like the color of the drapes in that hotel. That one's not on the beachfront. I know, let alone, well, here's the kind of car we're going to rent. It's on my phone, So, and, I always laughed. Everybody became their own travel agent when we got smartphones. And you might call a brick and mortar agency when you first got started and said, am I reading this right? Can I really get a ticket from here through Heathrow to Dubai and be there in 20 hours, 2 flights? Can I really do that? And what is a 767 anyway? Kind of thing. Whereas now people they don't even think twice about it.
Yeah.
They book a flight, and if they have to change the flight, they change the flight. If there's a penalty, they pay a penalty, and then it's okay, whatever.
So speaking on that, what can you say about the level of trust in the industry? Because having that leap of faith from having to question everything to just almost complete and total radical acceptance.
I think, we joke all the time. Well, I saw it on the internet. I think 99% of valid business, whether it's banking, travel, industry, retail, whatever, is mark-on, right? Now, there's that 1% of stuff that gives it a bad name, right? And now we're dealing with just this rash of AI-generated videos, to where I think people are going, well, I saw it on the internet, but there's no way that's true. My fear is that it'll become rampant enough that people will take all the false information that's out there and go, well, that is true. I saw it on the internet. They can't publish bad stuff, right? Can't lie to you, right? Isn't there someone watching them?
Media bias has definitely been
right.
changed a lot lately because of that.
I think as we all go on and we've accepted technology, we've accepted the internet and all that, I think it's all in. I mean, when was the last time, and I don't want to name names, but you got on to an online worldwide retailer and looked at the pictures and read the specs and ordered it and then thought, well, I wonder if that was all the ruse. Am I really going to get what I thought I was going to get in 3 days on my doorstep? Most people just close the app and go, it'll be here in 3 days. So at that level, I think it's 100% trust, just because those companies, especially those well-established companies that provide a service on the internet, have built the rapport to where there's no reason not to believe them.
Right.
And then they'll give it away. And then after all, if you don't like it, you send it back. So, okay, we all know who I'm talking about now. But I think that's how the industry has went, though. There was that distrust, right?
Right.
We've all heard stories, medieval times. It's sorcery. How in the world did they do that?
Yeah, there were some early days of sites where you didn't even get the thing that you ordered.
Right. And now in today's day, it's just like, no. And then you get on your little computer and go, look, it's sitting on my front porch. Here's a picture of it.
Right. And that's a problem that people like yourself in the industry have come around to solve.
Yeah.
And so would you say that's I guess that's kind of the purpose of any business is to solve a problem. And would you say that's what
or provide a service.
Provide a service.
Yeah, sure. But I think that's, customer satisfaction has got to be high, because we are still a social species and we still talk to people. And, the first thing after we talk about the weather and how bad traffic was, we're talking about, man, I can't believe I ordered something from ABC and they took my money and it never came and I'm having to fight and hassle. Well, what you just heard was don't ever order anything from ABC. Oh, Dave there had all those problems with those, Right. And so I think it's that level of trust and that level of acceptance we have within our society, We always said, besides providing good service, the last thing we wanted to do was be on the evening news,
Absolutely.
And because then people who weren't even thinking about traveling hear on the news about how, there's a big computer outage and everybody got stuck and there weren't enough hotels and we're not going to fly with them or we're not going to use them, when we go on our trip. But I think that respect in the industry, that loyalty is a word I'll use, especially with some of the online realtors and service providers, had to be very much earned. But it's not just something that you earn and keep forever. It's kind of like sitting on your laurels in a job. You've got to keep striving to make it better, right?
Right.
Add those little creature comfort things like, here's a picture of it on your doorstep, or here it is, this is where it's at, real-time status. I ordered something not that long ago and I clicked on it and it said, do you want to track the truck? And I clicked on the map. I'm like, sure, where's the truck? And I knew it would take 20 minutes to go from where they were to me at minimum. And I went and did some other stuff and came back, and it wasn't here in 20 minutes. It took a half hour because they made another stop. But, that was just an extra feature. That was an extra convenience.
Right.
that they were able to provide. You know, I have a birthday coming up, and so everybody's favorite thing to do on their birthday is go renew their car tags, right?
Love it.
Used to be very arduous, going with papers and staples and paper clips and all this stuff, and you stand in line and you hope you don't get that person because they don't seem to be having a good day. And now you can do it all online. Matter of fact, in Georgia, you can go to the grocery store and scan what the county sent you and put your
send
card in,
emissions
and
thing
it
if you need it.
spits out the sticker, and you go put it on your tag in the parking lot, and you're good for a year. You know, and so the convenience of some of that stuff, you know, is just amazing to me. You know, especially back when I think of that crotchety old woman in Platte City, Missouri. No, I'm just.
Oh goodness.
Wait till she went to lunch and then get your tags. You know?
Well, that is that's all I have for you, David.
All right.
Thank you so much for this interview.
Oh, certainly.
Appreciate you coming.
I hope I provided a little bit of
to
enlightenment.
your living room.
Maybe a ton of entertainment, you know. But thank you for thinking of me. I appreciate it.
Of course, of course. Do you have any other lasting thoughts or last thoughts? Maybe something that I missed that you'd like to say?
I think unlike in the 50s and 60s, computers are here to stay.
Mhm.
You know, IT is not going to go anywhere. We are all so dependent on everything IT driven. And I think it's a really good thing. I can't imagine it working as well as it is right now any other way. And so if you're wanting to get in the industry, again, it's everywhere. Just find what part of that industry you have interest in or a niche for. Or let's just be honest, some of us took the job because I actually got the job. And so I learned to love that part about it. You know, that's how the life works, right? You know, but I think for me, especially when I look back on the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and all the events that brought my wife and I here and me to those jobs. And, you know, I think it all came down to the same basic things that our parents and our grandparents and their parents did was work hard, do an honest effort for the honest wage, and be passionate about it. And if those things don't fit what you're doing, then maybe you should find something else to work on. You know, if you need that job to pay the bills, then work really hard to get the passion, work really hard to make, because there's a line of people ready to take your spot, you know? So, but I think it's a very exciting time. I'm very privileged to have lived when I was. You know, I always said I wish I was on with Lewis and Clark, and that's just because it sounds like fun to go hike across the mountains to the other ocean. But the reality is, I wouldn't have made it up the river past St. Louis. I'm sure of it. So I'm glad I can read about that and watch it on the TV and stuff. You know, but no, I think, like I said, computers are here to stay. So find your niche if that's what you're interested in, you know. So
if you ever get sent back to 180, I think, what was it, 2 or 04, and let me know how it
Thomas
goes.
Jefferson and all those guys, yeah. So the great crusade, I think, is what they called it. Yeah, but no, like I said, it's been very fun. I've really enjoyed it, and it's hard to believe I did it for almost 40 years and was able to retire and enjoy it. And I feel like I'm outdated now because 3 years times 4, I'm almost a dozen years out on technology. And I try to stay current with things, not as innate as I did when I had to use them for day-to-day job, but just the technology and, you know, how things work around the house, if nothing else. It's fun. So,
Good stuff.
yeah.
Well,
All right. Well, thank you,
David.
sir.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Me too. It was a good conversation.
All righty. Appreciate you.
Wires.